If you have ever drunk a glass of cold water first thing in the morning, before food, before coffee, before anything, you felt it. A cold that moves downward behind the sternum, palpable for 3 or 4 seconds as the water descends. A settling in the upper abdomen as it pulls against the gastric wall. And within 20 to 30 minutes, a bowel movement that arrives more reliably than any other signal your body produces at that hour. That cold you felt behind your breastbone was not passing through empty space. It was passing alongside your vagus nerve, the primary cable of the parasympathetic nervous system, separated from the water by 3 to 5 millimeters of tissue, less than the thickness of 2 stacked coins. And a receptor in your stomach lining, a cold sensing channel called TRPM8, was about to determine which branch of your nervous system would control your digestion, your heart rate, and your blood pressure for the next several hours. Hot coffee activates a different receptor through that nerve and sends the opposite signal. One cable, carrying opposite instructions depending entirely on temperature, the physics of how that receptor opens, why its molecular mirror responds to coffee, and why the distinction matters more after 55 than it does at 30 is where this reaches in its second half. But what happens at each station, the cold water passes through on the way down, explains why the temperature of the first thing you drink is not a preference. It is a physiological instruction. Your stomach has been empty for 8 to 12 hours. The muscular walls have contracted to a resting volume of roughly 50 milliliters, the mucosal folds pressed together, the surface area reduced to a fraction of what it becomes during a meal. The gastric acid that your parietal cells secrete continuously, even during sleep, has concentrated in that small residual volume to a pH of 1 to 2, strong enough to dissolve zinc, strong enough to denature protein on contact, and the mucus barrier protecting the stomach wall from its own acid is at its thinnest because the pathway that thickens it, prostaglandin, E2, requires food in the stomach to activate. Before anything arrives, the barrier is of minimum thickness and the acid is at maximum concentration. Meanwhile, you have been losing water all night, 300 to 500 milliliters left through your lungs and skin over 8 hours. Every exhalation carried moisture, and obligatory transepidermal diffusion through the skin continues regardless of room humidity or temperature. This loss is passive, continuous, and cannot be prevented by any environmental or behavioral adjustment you make. That water came from your plasma, the liquid component of blood that carries cells and proteins in suspension. Over 8 hours, the loss concentrates everything that remains. Red blood cells, platelets, fibrinogen, clotting factors, all suspended in a smaller fluid volume. Hematocrit, the percentage of blood volume occupied by red blood cells, rises by 1 to 3 percentage points between evening and morning. That shift is small in absolute terms but measurably increases the blood's resistance to flow. Your blood, when you wake up, is thicker than when you fell asleep. For a 30-year-old with clean arteries, this is nothing. But the relationship between viscosity and vessel diameter follows a fourth power law, described by Poiseuille in 1840. If a vessel has lost half its diameter to atherosclerotic narrowing, maintaining equivalent flow requires not twice the pressure, but 16 times. Thicker blood through narrower vessels compounds multiplicatively, not additively. And by 55, most people have measurable narrowing, whether they know it or not. The arithmetic applies every morning. Morning is the peak period for acute cardiovascular events, as Muller and colleagues established in the New England Journal of Medicine. A convergence window where the cortisol awakening response raises blood pressure, the sympathetic surge of waking increases heart rate, platelet aggregability peaks, and the blood itself is thicker than at any other point in the day. 4 independent risk factors arriving simultaneously. The viscosity is the only one you can address before your feet touch the floor. Cold water reaches the small intestine faster than warm water, passes through aquaporin channels into the plasma, and begins diluting the concentrated blood within 15 to 20 minutes. The convergence window closes by mid-morning. The dilution arrives well within it. But the cardiovascular protection is only one consequence of what happens when cold water arrives on an empty stomach. The temperature of the water is simultaneously doing something more specific at the nerve level, and it begins before the water even reaches the stomach. Your vagal trunk, the primary cable of the parasympathetic nervous system carrying fibers from the brainstem to nearly every organ below the diaphragm, runs through the posterior mediastinum alongside your esophagus for its entire thoracic length. The two structures travel bound together in the esophageal plexus, the vagal fibers wrapping around the esophagus in a mesh rather than running as a single cable, maximizing the contact surface between nerve tissue and esophageal wall. The separation between the lumen where water passes and the space where the vagal trunk sits is 3 to 5 millimeters of tissue. Anything that changes the temperature of the esophageal lumen changes the temperature of the vagal trunk within seconds. 300 milliliters of water at 10 to 15 degrees descends the esophagus in 3 to 5 seconds, propelled by a peristaltic wave, the coordinated contraction of circular muscle behind the bolus and relaxation ahead of it that moves the water downward regardless of body position. You can swallow while lying down, while inverted, while floating in zero gravity. The peristaltic wave does the work, not gravity. During that 3 to 5 second passage, the cold water reduces the temperature of the esophageal wall through direct thermal conduction. The gradient is steep, more than 20 degrees of difference across 3 to 5 millimeters of tissue, producing a rate of heat transfer that cools the outer surface of the esophageal wall, the surface closest to the vagal trunk, by several degrees within seconds. The vagal trunk receives transient cooling that lasts for the duration of the bolus passage and dissipates as surrounding mediastinal tissue rewarms over the following 10 to 20 seconds, driven by blood flow and metabolic heat production from the tissue. Nerve conduction velocity is temperature dependent. Cooling a peripheral nerve by even 2 to 3 degrees alters the timing of its action potentials and modulates its firing threshold. The transient vagal cooling during esophageal passage shifts the nerve's excitability in a direction that contributes to the parasympathetic tone that follows. And that cold you felt behind the sternum, the palpable sensation of temperature moving downward through the chest, was the esophageal passage alongside the vagal trunk. You have been feeling the anatomy your whole life without knowing what it was. Every morning that 3-second descent, that palpable cold behind the breastbone. The physics was happening whether you understood it or not. Below the esophagus, the water enters the stomach, and TRPM8 begins firing. The receptor detects the temperature drop within seconds of the water contacting the mucosal surface and sends a signal through the vagus nerve to the brainstem. But it sends that signal simultaneously with a second signal the stomach is already generating from the arriving volume. Stretch receptors in the gastric wall detect the distension and fire their own afferent signal through that shared nerve. Two types of sensory information, thermal and mechanical, arriving at the brainstem simultaneously through a shared pathway. The brainstem computes a combined parasympathetic output that is disproportionately larger than the sum of the individual inputs. This is multimodal summation, the brainstem's response to receiving two different types of sensory information through a shared pathway, and it explains why cold water on an empty stomach produces a stronger colonic response than either cold or volume would produce alone. The thermal signal alone would produce a modest parasympathetic output. The stretch signal alone would trigger a standard gastrocolic reflex. Together, arriving simultaneously through that shared pathway, they produce a motor output to the colon that exceeds the arithmetic sum of both, a combined signal amplified by the brainstem's integration circuitry. The amplification is automatic. Two afferent inputs through one nerve produce a motor output stronger than either input deserves on its own. This drives the reflex that follows. Gastric distension triggers the gastrocolic reflex, an increase in colonic motility that begins within minutes. The pathway is specific and well mapped. Stretch receptors in the gastric wall detect the distension, generate afferent signals through the vagus to the brainstem, and the brainstem increases parasympathetic output to the colon through the pelvic splanchnic nerves. The colon responds by initiating high-amplitude propagating contractions, mass movements, coordinated propulsive waves that can traverse the entire length of the large intestine in 30 to 60 seconds. These are not the gentle segmental contractions that slowly churn and absorb throughout the day. A mass movement is the colonic equivalent of a coordinated flush, a high-force wave that propels everything in its path toward the rectum faster in a single contraction than slow mixing moves contents in an hour. And this reflex responds to mechanical stretch, not to nutritional content. 300 milliliters of water produces a comparable stretch signal to 300 milliliters of juice or broth. The gastric stretch receptors cannot distinguish between water and wine. They measure distension, and distension is a function of volume. Volume triggers the reflex. Temperature amplifies it. Cold water produces a measurably stronger gastrocolic reflex than warm water at identical volume, as Rao and colleagues documented in the American Journal of Gastroenterology. The thermal channel adds a multiplier to the mechanical stretch that volume alone provides. And the reflex is strongest after an overnight fast because the gastric mechanoreceptors have been at resting baseline for hours. The first distension they detect produces the largest afferent signal of the entire day. Receptor accommodation is the term for this, and it works against you as the day progresses. Stretch receptors reduce their firing rate under sustained or repeated stimulation. The first meal of the day overcomes a fully reset receptor population, producing the strongest possible gastrocolic response. By the second meal, the mechanoreceptors have begun adapting. By the third, the response has weakened substantially even at comparable volumes. The morning is the one window where volume and temperature alone can reliably trigger the reflex without food, without fiber, without any pharmaceutical intervention. That window exists because the receptor spent 8 hours in silence, and the first input after silence is the input they respond to most strongly. Cold water also accelerates plasma recovery faster than warm water. The temperature differential relaxes the pyloric sphincter, speeding gastric emptying into the duodenum where the majority of water absorption occurs. The water crosses enterocyte membranes through aquaporin channels, dedicated water transport proteins embedded in the intestinal lining that move water molecules across cell membranes at rates far exceeding passive diffusion. Each aquaporin channel transports roughly 3 billion water molecules per second, a throughput that explains why plasma dilution begins within 15 to 20 minutes of drinking the water. The hemodilution reduces viscosity, lowers shear stress on arterial walls, and begins restoring the fluid to cellular ratio toward its evening baseline. The glass of water that was physiologically optional at 35 becomes the single most consequential cardiovascular intervention of the day at 65, requiring nothing except a refrigerator and 30 seconds. Cold water simultaneously dilutes the concentrated overnight acid, reducing the chemical load on a mucosal barrier at its thinnest and most vulnerable after the overnight fast. If you have ever felt a burning sensation or a knot of discomfort after drinking coffee on an empty stomach, that was concentrated acid meeting a mucosal barrier at minimum thickness. The burning came from the acid response the coffee triggered in an unprotected stomach. You now know what happens at each station: esophagus, stomach, colon, blood, and why the temperature of the water amplifies the signal at every one. The question changes. From what happens to why? Why does a temperature difference of 20 degrees determine which signal the nerve carries? Why does coffee send the opposite instruction through that cable? The answer is a pair of molecular thermometers embedded in your stomach lining, and the physics of how they open explains everything the first half described. I tracked this on myself for a month, 30 mornings total. 20 of them I drank cold water first. 10. I drank coffee first. 18 of the 20 cold water mornings produced a gastrocolic response within 30 minutes. 4 of the 10 coffee mornings did. The difference was consistent across the entire month, independent of what I ate the night before, independent of sleep quality, independent of hydration the previous day. Something at the receptor level was producing a reliable, reproducible divergence, and the molecular physics of that divergence is what the first half withheld. TRPM8 is a protein embedded in the cell membrane that functions as a molecular thermometer. 4 identical subunits arranged symmetrically around a central pore, each with its own temperature-sensing domain that responds independently to cooling. When enough subunits detect sufficient cold, the pore opens cooperatively, allowing calcium and sodium ions to flow into the cell. That ion influx depolarizes the membrane and generates an action potential that propagates along vagal fibers to the brainstem, as McKemmy and colleagues identified in Nature in 2002. Cooperative gating is what makes TRPM8 behave differently from a simple on-off switch. Each subunit senses temperature independently, but the pore requires multiple subunits to reach their threshold before it opens. This means the channel responds to a range of temperatures with graded sensitivity rather than flipping at a single precise degree. Below 26 degrees, subunits begin responding. The colder the temperature, the more subunits activate, and the wider the pore opens. The conductance increases with cooling until the pore reaches maximum width, at which point further cooling produces no additional signal. The channel has a ceiling. Menthol activates this channel through a different mechanism. The molecule binds to a specific site on the TRPM8 protein and forces the pore open regardless of temperature. This is why a menthol lozenge produces a cooling sensation in a warm mouth, and why menthol-containing chest rubs produce a cold sensation on warm skin. The channel cannot distinguish between actual cold and a molecule that fits its binding site. Both open the pore, both generate the signal, both produce the subjective experience of cold without any actual temperature change. Your gastric TRPM8 channels spend most of their existence at core body temperature, 37 degrees, 11 degrees above their activation threshold. Sitting in the mucosal lining, pores closed, generating no signal at all. Cold water below 15 degrees drops the mucosal surface temperature below 26 degrees within seconds, and the channels open across the gastric surface simultaneously. Hundreds of receptors on dozens of vagal afferent endings firing in concert, sending the brainstem a thermal signal it interprets as cold inside the core. Well, the signal is strongest in the first 30 to 60 seconds of cold contact. After that, calcium accumulation inside the cell, the calcium that entered through the open pore, triggers a feedback mechanism that partially closes the channel, reducing conductance over time. This is why the initial cold sensation when you drink is sharper than what follows. The channels fire at maximum conductance on first contact and then adapt. That initial burst of maximal signaling is the strongest parasympathetic input the gastric vagal afferents generate, and it is what drives the amplified gastrocolic reflex the first half described. Now, the distinction between internal cold and external cold matters here, because the autonomic response is qualitatively different. External cold, cold air on the skin, cold water on the face, triggers sympathetic vasoconstriction as the dominant response. The body interprets external cold as a threat to core temperature and responds accordingly. Peripheral vessels constrict to conserve heat, blood pressure rises, heart rate increases, and blood flow redirects from the periphery to vital organs. The response is proportional to the perceived threat, colder external temperatures producing stronger sympathetic activation. Internal cold does not trigger that response. 300 milliliters of cold water contains less than 1 kilojoule of thermal deficit relative to body temperature. Your metabolic heat production replaces that within minutes without any autonomic intervention. There is no threat. There is no emergency. The parasympathetic component of the TRPM8 signal predominates because the sympathetic alarm has no reason to fire. The brainstem receives a cold signal from inside the core and interprets it not as danger but as information. This is why drinking cold water produces a calming parasympathetic shift, while splashing cold water on the face produces alertness and a spike in heart rate. Same molecular channel family, same temperature range. Opposite autonomic outcome, determined entirely by whether the cold is inside or outside the thermal barrier of the body. The body classifies internal cold as safe and external cold as threatening, and the classification routes the signal to opposing nervous system branches through identical neural architecture. Well, the molecular opposite sits in that stomach lining waiting for coffee. TRPV1 is the warm sensing ion channel, the thermal mirror of TRPM8. It detects temperatures above approximately 43 degrees, produces a sensation of heat, and mediates the burning of capsaicin. The parallel is exact. Cold has its chemical mimic in menthol. Heat has its chemical mimic in capsaicin. Both mimics work by binding directly to the ion channel that detects the temperature they simulate. Hot coffee at 60 to 70 degrees activates TRPV1 in the stomach lining with every sip. The vagal afferent signals travel to the brainstem through the vagus, the identical nerve that carries TRPM8 signals. But the brainstem routes them to different output circuits. TRPM8 feeds parasympathetic output, rest and digest. TRPV1 feeds sympathetic modulation, alert and mobilize. The same nerve carrying opposite instructions depending entirely on which molecular thermometer opened. Caffeine compounds the sympathetic shift. It blocks adenosine receptors throughout the central nervous system, preventing the drowsiness signal that accumulated overnight from reaching its target neurons. Adenosine builds up during waking hours as a byproduct of cellular energy metabolism, and during sleep the brain clears the accumulated load, resetting the system. Caffeine's molecular structure fits into the adenosine receptor without activating it, occupying the binding site like a key that enters the lock but refuses to turn, preventing the real molecule from delivering its signal. The blockade triggers compensatory cortisol release from the adrenal glands, a pharmacological spike landing on top of the cortisol awakening response, the body's own natural morning surge. The combined elevation can exceed either spike individually by 30 to 50%. That compounded cortisol suppresses parasympathetic output and directly opposes the vagal tone that cold water would otherwise establish. The morning cortisol peak is the one window where additional cortisol stimulation is least needed and most disruptive. The body is already producing maximum cortisol on its own. Adding caffeine during this window does not accelerate waking. It overdrives the system already at peak output. And then, coffee's organic acids, chlorogenic acid, quinic acid, compounds that survive the roasting process, stimulate further gastric acid secretion through the gastric acid secretion through the gastrin pathway. G cells in the antrum release gastrin, parietal cells increase hydrochloric acid output, and the total acid volume rises in a stomach already acidified to its overnight maximum. Cold water does the inverse, diluting the concentrated acid, reducing the chemical load on a mucosal barrier at minimum thickness. The dilution buys time. 20 minutes between cold water and coffee allows the water to begin stimulating prostaglandin-mediated mucosal thickening before the acidic coffee arrives. The barrier that was at minimum thickness when you woke has started rebuilding by the time the coffee reaches it. Coffee first drink has never established that buffer. Whatever arrives first after 8 hours of neurological silence determines the autonomic tone your gut operates under for the next several hours. Parasympathetic or sympathetic. The molecular thermometer that opens first sets the tone, and the tone propagates through every organ the vagus nerve reaches. That propagation is why this restructured my morning sequence. The order of inputs determines which receptor opens first when two channels in adjacent tissue send opposite signals through a shared nerve. The cold water sets the parasympathetic foundation. The 20-minute gap allows the gastrocolic reflex to complete and gives the mucosal barrier time to begin thickening. The coffee arrives into a stomach that has already been diluted, protected, and set to parasympathetic baseline. Vagal tone declines approximately 1% per year after 30. Established from heart rate variability data confirmed across multiple longitudinal studies tracking autonomic function, the gut vagal afferents follow a matching decline curve as the cardiac vagal afferents. The nerve degrades uniformly, not selectively, affecting every organ it innervates at a comparable rate. By 65, the vagal baseline driving the gastrocolic reflex has lost roughly 35% of its peak capacity. The reflex still fires. The nerve carrying the signal has lost gain with each decade, and the colonic response that once arrived within 20 minutes now takes 40 or may not arrive at all. Colonic transit time confirms the pattern: 24 to 36 hours in a young adult, 48 to 72 hours in adults over 65, as Madsen measured using radiopaque markers tracked through serial abdominal radiographs. The slowing concentrates in the left colon and sigmoid, where mass movement propulsive force has weakened most. Stool accumulates in the segment closest to the rectum because the contractions that should push it the final distance have lost their amplitude. The gastric emptying rate slows along a matching trajectory. The peristaltic waves that propel food through the small intestine weaken in both frequency and force. The entire conveyor belt is decelerating, powered by a nerve losing output year by year. If you have noticed that morning regularity has become less predictable over the past decade, you are not imagining it. You are feeling a 35% reduction in the neural drive that powers the system, not a failure of diet or discipline. A measurable decline in the nerve that carries the signal. Morning constipation after 60 is among the most common gastrointestinal complaints in clinical practice, and it traces directly to this mechanism. The nerve still functions. Its gain has decreased. But TRPM8 does not decline with age the way the nerve does. Ion channels are protein structures embedded in cell membranes, replaced through normal cellular turnover on a timescale of days to weeks. The gastric TRPM8 receptors are as responsive to cold at 65 as they were at 30. The channel protein rebuilds continuously, and the cold sensitivity holds. The nerve has lost gain, the receptor has not. Two components of one signaling chain, aging at entirely different rates, through entirely different physics. This means cold water provides a proportionally larger benefit to a 65-year-old than to a 30-year-old. Not because the channel works differently at 65, but because the vagal baseline it amplifies has fallen further from its peak. The thermal input compensates for what the weakened nerve can no longer drive alone. A 30-year-old with full vagal tone gets a modest boost from the cold amplification. A 65-year-old with 35% less vagal capacity gets a boost that can mean the difference between the reflex completing and the reflex failing to arrive. The receptor that has not aged compensates for the nerve that has. The morning intervention that was a minor physiological optimization at 30 becomes a functional compensation mechanism at 65. The physics remained, the body around it aged. Anyone taking medication requiring empty stomach absorption should confirm with their physician that the accelerated gastric emptying does not alter the absorption window for their specific prescription. This matters particularly for thyroid medications and certain osteoporosis drugs that depend on precise timing in an empty stomach. Refrigerator temperature is sufficient. 10 to 15 degrees activates TRPM, 8 well above its threshold. Ice water is unnecessary and may provoke gastric cramping in some individuals. The channel's activation curve plateaus once the pore is fully open. Colder does not produce a proportionally stronger signal beyond maximum conductance. Your refrigerator delivers the activation the physics requires, and it does not reward extremes. 300 to 500 milliliters, 1 glass, before anything else. Every station it passes through, esophagus, stomach, colon, blood, sends a signal the body has been waiting 8 hours to receive. And the molecular thermometer, embedded in the stomach lining, still perfectly calibrated, is waiting for the temperature to tell it what signal to send.